even the private sector to be able to unlock resources externally. So in terms of the composition of the debt, about 8.4 billion is external debt, 2.1 billion is the RBZ external debt, and 204 million US is the domestic debt. And I should also highlight the fact that government signed the global compensation deed of 3.5 with the former white farmers in 2020, and the bulk of these resources will be financed through borrowings. So obviously that's going to then exacerbate our debt situation. So our total public and publicly guaranteed external debt, including RBZ external debt, is 10.5 billion. Then RBZ external debt is 2.1 billion, which represents 20% of the total PPG debt. So when you exclude the RBZ debt, the total external debt is 8.4 billion, which represents a 4.1% increase from about 8.1 billion as at 2019. So the country has continued to accumulate the arrears, which has then resulted in an increase in our PPG external debt. Now, when we look at the PPG external debt component that is owed to our multilateral creditors, it's at 2.68 billion, of which about 1.53 billion is owed to the World Bank Group. 729 million is owed to the African Development Bank. 356 million is owed to the European Investment Bank. And 68 million US dollars is owed to other multilateral creditors. So that chart there shows the trends in terms of our external debt from 1980, 700 million, to where we are, about 10.7 billion. Now, when you look at what we call the disbursed outstanding debt, or the debt outstanding disbursed, it only represents about 37.8% of the total PPG debt, and the rest, about 63%, are arrears. And of the about 7 billion non-guaranteed PPG external debt, about 26% are debt outstanding disbursed or DOD, while 39.3% are arrears. And also, the interest payments and the other penalty charges have now exceeded the principal amount borrowed. So the principal amount borrowed represents around 27% of GDP, or about 3.983 billion. So the 63% really are our penalty charges and interest payments, which is very, very significant. Of course, we have cleared our arrears with the IMF of 107.8 billion. That was done in 2016. And the government has also been making token payments to multilateral creditors, which is quite important to do. Now, our bilateral PPG external debt is 5.75 billion. And of that amount, 3.79 billion is owed to the Paris Club bilateral creditors. And we owe Germany 1.02 billion, we owe France 724 million, we owe Japan 435 million, we owe the UK 416 billion, and we are owing 285 billion to the US. In terms of the non-Paris Club creditors, we owe them a total of 1.67 billion US, and this comprises largely China, who we owe 1.57 billion, and India, who we owe 70 million US. Because I've already made mention of the RBZ Debt Assumption Act of 2015, which was valued at 1.3 billion. So the current external debt by the Reserve Bank is $2.1 billion. And the bulk of this was contracted through past fiscal activities, in particular RBZ guarantee facilities for the importation of strategic commodities and raw materials. However, our total debt stock excludes non-guaranteed facilities, which amount to 376 million US, and blocked funds that are estimated at 2.9 billion. So these blocked funds include foreign exchange denominated legacy debts. So there's a process of validation and reconciliation that is currently ongoing before that debt can also be assumed. But once that debt is assumed, it will actually take our total debt stock to 14 billion US, which is about 95% of our total output. And the applications for qualification under the legacy debt framework were closed in 2020. So that window is actually closed. So the assumption of that legacy debt will result in our indebtedness actually ballooning to $14 billion. So in terms of our external loan disbursements in 2020, that's the picture. So the loans came mainly from the OPEC Fund for International Development, as well as the China Exim Bank. So those loans are financing those facilities. The Wange 7 and 8 thermal power station expansion refurbishment project, the Robert G. Mugabe International Airport expansion project, the TEL 1 backbone network. So those are the amounts in terms of those loans. So the challenge there is that our loan contraction, especially from China, because we are having now to rely overly from our Chinese friends, and this could it represents a significant downside risk, which could threaten macroeconomic sustainability also going forward. So those are the line loans that were signed by government in 2020. So the first facility, that's the refurbishment of Wange 1 to 6. It's being financed through the India Exim Bank. The loan was signed on the 24th of February 2020, and it's valued at 310 million. There's a maturity of 25 years, and there's a grace period of 5 years. And the interest payment there is 1.5% per annum. The grant element is around 32.95. Then the second loan facility is from the Arab Bank for the Economic Development of Africa, BADIA, and it's relating to urgent response operation to the fight against COVID. It was signed on 28 August 2020, and it's valued at only 10 million, with the maturity of 20 years. So according to the 2021 midterm fiscal policy review, in terms of our debt service payments, we made debt service payments of 17.04 million US, and these were largely towards some multilateral creditors, as well as bilateral non-Paris Club creditors, and a few other token payments of 1.6 million. So in terms of the disaggregation of our quarterly token payments, These were through the multilateral development banks and divided as follows: the World Bank, 1 million, the African Development Bank Group, 500,000, the European Investment Bank, 100,000 US. Now let's look at our domestic debt profile. So we have a domestic debt stock of 20.9 billion, which is around 242 million US dollars. So this is at the end of April 2021. And there's been an increase from $16.7 billion as at end of December 2020. In 27 billion. And it had reached 45% of GDP in 2018. So the domestic debt is largely being driven, or was largely being driven by the issuance of treasury bills, TBs. These are short-term debt instruments issued by government, as well as the use of the RBZ overdraft facility. So those are really the two culprits, or the two drivers of that domestic debt. However, like I've already highlighted, in terms of the real value of this debt, because of chronic high inflation, the real value is actually been significantly whittled down. And also the share dropped down significantly on account of statutory instrument 142, whereby there was a conversion of US dollar denominated debts during the multi-currency era to Zimbabwean dollars at an exchange rate of 1:1. So that table there shows the domestic debt composition over the period 2019 to 2021. Treasury bills, you can see the trends. It has actually increased from 1.2 billion in 2019 to 4.9 billion in 2021. Treasury bonds, these are more long term. They've increased from 7.7 billion in 2019 to 11.1 billion in 2020, and the current 13.6 billion. Then other domestic areas, in 2019 there was none. Then in 2020, they were estimated at 2.5 billion Zim dollars, and they've remained largely stagnant. Then in terms of the total domestic debt, you can see those trends. So this chart also shows the trends in terms of domestic debt from 1980. So you can see for the greater part of the period, the debt it's only really increased quite significantly during the period 1999 to 2004, but otherwise it's been largely insignificant. I think this I've already made reference to. So in terms of our treasury bill issuances, I've also highlighted this. We so far about 4.2 billion has been raised through the issuance of a TB, so that's also adding to the total domestic debt stock. And in 2000, about 50.3% of our treasury bills were raised through private placements, 12.3% were raised through the auction, and 44% were restructured treasury bills. So 485 billion worth of TBs were raised through the auction system at an average interest rate of about 16%, and $3.4 billion worth of treasury securities were restructured at an average interest rate of 7.6%, while about $4 billion was also raised through private placements at an average interest rate of about 20%. So in terms of the 7.85 billion raised through treasury bill issuances, about $4 billion was for health-related COVID expenditures. About 3.4 billion was for the restructuring of the existing debt stock, and about 327 million Zim dollars was expended on grain importation, while about 9 million is part of our cash flow management, including the maturity of treasury bills. So that chart there shows the domestic debt maturity profile in terms of our $16.7 billion domestic debt. Okay. And this chart shows the guarantees that were issued to domestic borrowers by the government. So you can see these are state enterprises, parastatals. So in 2020, government approved domestic borrowing by the Zimbabwe Power Company from the domestic market for its working capital requirements amounting to 50 billion. So this is in addition also to those guarantees that are shown in that chart. So that table there shows the key indicators in terms of our debt sustainability indicators. The first indicator there, that's our total PPG, external and domestic debt, is a percentage of our GDP. So there's been an improvement from 88% in 2019 to 73% in 2020. I think this improvement is also largely on account of the whittling down of our domestic debt stock. In terms of our total external debt stock to GDP, is a key indicator which also shows sustainability. It has actually worsened from 47% in 2019 to 71.2% in 2020. Then in terms of our total public and publicly guaranteed domestic debt stock to GDP, this one has improved very markedly from 41% in 2019 to 1.4% in 2020. Again, on account of the changes in currency as well as the chronic high inflation. In terms of our multilateral debt to total external debt stock, it has slightly improved from 27% in 2019, 25% in 2020. Our international reserves to total external debt stock, there's been an improvement from 0.9% in 2019 to 1.6% in 2020. And of course, I should also add the fact that Zimbabwe has just received special drawing rights, which are also going to bolster our international reserve position. They've already bolstered our international reserve position. Then in terms of our nominal GDP at market prices in Zim dollars, there's been a huge increase. But again, this increase is also largely on account of the inflation. Because when you consider these prices in nominal terms, you're actually taking into account also the effects of chronic high inflation. So a large component of that increase has to do with the chronic high inflation. I think the same also applies to our exports. Because in 2019 and 2020, our economy has been in decline. But of course, we're expecting the economy to rebound this year. Then, in terms of our international reserve position, it worsened from 292 million US to about 168 million US in 2020. But of course, for this year, it's going to improve quite significantly. Then, in terms of our import cover, this has also worsened from 7.7 to 7.4. Then, of course, in terms of our exchange rate, there has been a depreciation in the official exchange rate, and there's also been a significant depreciation even in terms of the black market exchange, which has then worsened our black market premium, which is a key driver again of the macroeconomic instability. In terms of our debt to export ratio, It has actually declined from 231%, 232% in 2019 to about 204% in 2020. In terms of our debt to revenue, I think the same trend also applies there. The same decline or southward trend, with the indicator declining from actually this is an improvement. It has actually improved from 591.35% to 479.37%. So this is actually an improvement. So in terms of the broader macroeconomic performance in 2020, the economy obviously declined, and that then also imposes significant pressures in terms of our debt sustainability. Because the best strategy of dealing with the debt situation is through inclusive growth. So as long as the economy is actually not growing, it means the productive capacity of the economy is weakening. And in 2019, the economy, it also contracted. So we have had 2 successive years of economic contraction, which then affects our debt sustainability. But of course, as I highlighted, the economy is expected to recover and to rebound in 2021, which is good for debt sustainability. Of course, the numbers vary depending on who you are listening to. Government is projecting about 7.8%. The IMF, the multilateral institutions are projecting around 5%, 4%. But what we know for sure is that the economy is going to recover for this year. And with this huge boost from the SDRs, if it's properly harnessed and leveraged in critical sectors that enhance productivity, that will be very positive for the economy, and it's also positive for debt sustainability. Because the pressures in terms of our fiscal expenditures remain also largely on account of the need to finance public health and to mitigate the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, the need to improve resources in critical sectors like water and sanitation, as well as social protection. I think social protection is very, very critical given the huge increase that we've seen in terms of our poverty numbers. So as at end of end of 2020, about 50% of Zimbabweans were in extreme poverty, up from about 42% as at end of 2019. So that then imposes a lot of pressures on government also to do something in terms of social protection to mitigate the effects of extreme poverty on the ordinary Zimbabweans. Because we have seen some token payments to international financial institutions, largely the World Bank, the AFDB, and also the European Investment Bank, and the total debt services amounted to about 20.39 US dollars. But the key message is that for as long as we have these external payment areas, it will be very difficult for us to unlock fresh capital into the economy, especially from these traditional financiers and creditors. So it will actually mean that we probably have to overly rely on our friends from Arab and also our friends from the East, which may again also not be sustainable. So we also owe the International Fund. In fact, we've made token payments to the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, of 2.2 million. We've also made some token payments to IFAD of 920, about 1 million. We've also made token payments to Badia of about 0.17 million, 170,000. And the China Exim Bank, we've paid them about 17.1 million. So those are just token payments to non-multilateral financial institutions. For the COVID-19 has also affected the employment situation, which was already dire in any case. And in 2020, government issued guarantees valued at 15.18 billion US. So this was under the COVID-19 pandemic recovery and the stimulus package. And the steelmakers of Zimbabwe, they got a government guarantee of 11.18 billion, which largely went towards supporting its working capital requirements. While Sub-Saharan Tobacco got another guarantee of $4 million, which went towards the financing of its export and contract orders. Because Zimbabwe has not been able to benefit from the debt relief measures that have been announced, largely because of our arrears, especially our World Bank arrears. So we are actually not able to benefit from debt relief measures that other countries have benefited from during this COVID-19 season because of those arrears. In 2020, again, the government signed a $10 million concessional loan agreement with Badia. So this went towards the procurement of PPE, lab equipment, again towards our COVID-19 response. And this loan is a 25-year maturity with an interest rate of 2%. In terms of the development partners' pledges of 239 million, 118 million were actually disbursed in 2020. Zimbabwe also received so this is really a grant. So we received a 7 million grant, which went to addressing the impact of COVID-19 in the education sector. So it came from the Global Partnership for Education. So far, during the first half of this year, we have received about $17 million in terms of development assistance from our partners. And of course, the projection is for 214 million. And it's largely going towards financing our recovery and our response in our recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, I've mentioned this, we've received 961 million worth of SDRs. So this 961 million US in terms of our SDR allocation. So this was a global allocation, which also obviously benefited Zimbabwe as part of the global recovery efforts from the COVID-19 pandemic. So these resources are earmarked at sectors that should help economies globally to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Because we are hoping that government is not going to use these funds to pay our external payment arrears. These funds should go towards sectors like water and sanitation, critical landmark projects in water and sanitation, in energy, especially green energy, and also the social protection of the critical to help the economy to recover better from the COVID-19 pandemic. Because the good thing is that this is really not a loan, but it's an allocation. So that's very good. So let's look at some of the recommendations that have come up from the past reports, and to what extent they've been taken up by government for implementation. I think a number of recommendations have come up in the past, including the imperative of maintaining the budget deficit within sustainable levels. And of course, government has been churning out budget surplus. But of course, that we then need to interrogate that again, but probably not for today. But suffice it to say that we have had a budget surplus of 20.6 billion, which was actually recorded in 2020. And for the first half of this year, there was a slight deficit, I think, of around 500. Actually, we had a surplus again for the first half of this year of around 507 or 570 million dollars. So I think we've continued with this surplus. But again, it's largely on account of the fiscal austerity thrust, I think, in terms of our macroeconomic policy, that has not really changed. Also on the back of wage compression and inadequate investments, public investments in critical sectors like water and sanitation, health, and social protection. Because there has been some debt restructuring of our domestic debt that has actually taken place. But of course, debt restructuring doesn't really reduce your indebtedness. It only restructures your debt in terms of when it will fall. Of course, another key recommendation was on the need to sustainably grow the economy, to inclusively grow the economy by targeting sectors that are pro-poor, inclusive, and sustainable. Of course, it's been a challenge because even when you look at those periods where in our economy has been growing over the past 2 years, that growth has not been inclusive. That growth has not been decent wage. That growth has not been sustainable. So I think achieving sustainable growth will always remain a challenge for us, especially given the fact that even for this year, the sectors that are projected to drive the rebound are really sectors that are not pro-poor or inclusive or employment intensive rather. Because when you look at our FDI inflows again, they've been on a downward trajectory. Last year alone, we received 194 million, down from about 250 in 2019. So in terms of FDI inflows, there's also been a big challenge, and again that then leaves the economy with a huge financing gap in terms of financing critical investment projects. For the issue of policy consistency, that this has been talked about many forums, I think it still remains a challenge. Of course, government, when you talk to government, they will tell you that it's important to be changing policy here and there in line with prevailing circumstances and the situation in the economy. But of course, to investors and to others, it is then construed as a policy consistency. It also obviously is related to the issue of the inclusivity in terms of our policy formulation processes. I think we need a more inclusive institutional structures and frameworks for policy formulation, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. I think going forward, and also even inclusive institutional frameworks in terms of our natural resource governance, which, if well managed, could help us in terms of domestic resource mobilization, and also in terms of the retirement of our external payment areas. Exchange rate stability, we've seen a bit of that, but obviously the major challenge has to do with the structural challenges really within the current auction system. When you look at the average demand for foreign currency in Zimbabwe, based on total imports for total average monthly imports, we are looking at about 500 billion. So that's the demand for foreign currency a month, and the auction system at best can only provide about 240 million. So in August, the government provided, the Reserve Bank provided 240 million. And obviously that then leaves a huge gap in terms of foreign exchange requirements. So most people have to rely on the black market. So again, the exchange rate stability is not sustainable. It's not been sustainable because of the perception, maybe they're not perceptions, but then because the perceptions that the exchange rate is being managed, especially given the huge gap between the demand for foreign currency and the supply. So the demand is not being satisfied. So there's a huge gap in terms of the demand and supply, which should result probably in an exchange rate adjustment or depreciation. So the DMO to abide by provisions of the law, I think there has been an improvement there. This one doesn't repeat. Conduct regular audits. I think this is being done in line with Section 77 of the Public Debt Management Act. But of course, there is need for a comprehensive citizen audit. I think this can be done even. This can be a partnership between the Parliament and civil society organizations to really carry out a citizen audit of the current debt, I think that will be critical, and that will go a long way in terms of enhancing the issues of transparency as well as accountability. Public access, I think Treasury has improved them. They now publish the terms and conditions of executed loan agreements and guarantees in the government gazette. Public engagement for debt strategy. I think this is not. I think there's room for more work there in that regard in terms of public engagement, and obviously this platform I think is also important in terms of enhancing the engagement of the public through CSOs in sustainable debt strategy and implementation. Engagement with creditors, yes, there is some engagement in terms of consultations, but in terms of the tangible results, there is not much to show for that. But there is some engagement that's currently happening, and also the token payments that are being made, they're also really part of that engagement. But I think there's more that can also be done in terms of strengthening our engagement and making it also more inclusive. Then framework for managing contingent liabilities arising from guarantees. I think a framework has been developed. In terms of our debt management strategy, so the country is currently implementing a medium debt strategy of 2016 to 2021. For the results have not been forthcoming, they haven't been impressive. But like I have already highlighted, as long as there are challenges which then affect inclusive and sustainable growth and development, then it will always be difficult to sustainably address issues of debt. And as long as you also have issues of corruption, illicit financial flows, then again, it then makes it problematic to sustainably address issues of debt. So according to the AAGB, Zimbabwe on average we are losing $3 billion through illicit financial flows. So that's quite a huge amount. And that also then speaks to weaknesses in terms of our key institutions that I've already also highlighted earlier on. So the issue of corruption, I think it needs to be dealt with. And there are ways and means of doing that. One of the best ways is through strengthening institutions, making your institutions more inclusive and transparent, reforming of state enterprises and parastatals, because a lot of the corruption has also been taking place through state institutions like parastatals and state enterprises. So I think in terms of progress with respect to the reform of those key institutions, I think it's been very slow. So I think there's need for expediting the reform of parastatals. Of course, when you say reform, it's not synonymous with privatization. Of course, there are some that can be privatized, but some should remain in public hands because they play a critical public good role. When you look at China, China has not really privatized their parastatals. They've merely reformed them. And Chinese parastatals, they are contributing as much as 5% to GDP. In Zimbabwe, our parastatals are contributing around 3% to GDP. So I think there's room to reform parastatals, state enterprises as a way of dealing with corruption. And that will also then strengthen our capacity to address our indebtedness more sustainably. Because naming and shaming the corrupt and disallowing or banning people that are convicted of corruption from holding public office. So when you look at the National Development Strategy #1, it also proposes a strategy that involves limiting recourse to central bank borrowing. Of course, we've already seen that. We've seen a bit of discipline in terms of money supplied, especially for this year. The NDS also talks about encouraging the listing of bonds on government bonds on the securities exchange market. I think this is critical also in terms of enhancing transparency and accountability in the whole debt contraction process by government. And those are some of the policies that government is really come up with from a historical perspective. The domestic debt restructuring policy of 2001 to 2008, the poor economic performance, macroeconomic performance affected the effectiveness and results. Then government also had a sustainable and holistic debt strategy of 2010. Yeah. So here no debt was actually paid. Then we adopted the Zimbabwe accelerated arrears clearance debt and development strategy. Then also we had the Lima strategy. But I think one key point that we need to highlight is the lack of a broad-based inclusivity in terms of the crafting, and also then which then also then affects the implementation of these strategies. So these are strategies that are being driven largely from the top down. So I think I would really advocate for greater inclusivity, greater broad-based participation when coming up with areas clearing strategies or debt resolution strategies. Because in 2019 May, government also signed the staff monitored program with the IMF. I think this also needs to be looked at from the broader debt resolution strategy of government, because there were the number of policy mistakes and the number of challenges that were encountered that then affected again sustainable macroeconomic performance. Of course, the fund, the IMF, it also made a number of recommendations. Some have been taken on board, like the need for a market-based, but again, there are issues with respect to whether it's truly market-based in terms of foreign exchange management and exchange rate determination in the country. Of course, some of this I've already highlighted, but a major downside to this, of course, I've also highlighted this earlier, the contraction of new loans from China. I think it's a major downside to this. But of course, government, there's very few degrees of freedom and probably limited options. I think we are able to seek recourse, more and more recourse from our friends in China, and also from our friends in Arab world. Then we also look at some of the options that are, of course, we don't qualify for EPIC. But I was just reading earlier today, Sudan is just recently qualified under the enhanced heavily indebted poor countries initiative. But Zimbabwe, as it stands, we actually don't qualify for the initiative. So let me not dwell too much on that. But when you look at even countries that have benefited from EPIC, many of them again who found themselves sooner rather than later, found themselves in debt distress situation. Why? Because they were not able to sustainably address the structural challenges associated with number one, lack of diversification in structural transformation. Number two, weaknesses in terms of institutional and also public finance management. So I think those are the challenges that have affected most countries that earlier on benefited from the EPIC, who then found themselves again even in greater debt. So for me, I'm a strong advocate of an endogenous debt resolution strategy, leveraging our own domestic resources. But of course, for that to happen, it means we then need to enhance your public resource management, your public finance management. And you also then need to deal with a number of other structural and institutional factors that impose the burdens on sustainable development. I think these are really some of the options that are available. Debt rescheduling. Again, debt rescheduling doesn't really reduce your debt obligation, it just defers your payment obligations. And it also probably changes the maturity of that debt. So, but it doesn't really reduce the fact that you still have to pay that obligation. Then other options that other countries have used, converting loans into equity investments or into infrastructure investments. Of course, these are a bit complicated in nature, but other countries that really done this with limited success. Then, of course, other countries have also been, in Zimbabwe, I think we have been borrowing against security of domestic assets, our domestic resources. So this option entails external borrowing to retire debt using the assets or the resources that would have been identified and then used as collateral. So it's then important to have a correct valuation of the public assets, because more often than not, developing economies have been guilty of undervaluing their public assets. So I think this is an option that can also be explored in terms of using natural resources as collateral. Then you can also borrow to finance a debt or to pay a debt, but this is not sustainable because it depends on the terms at which you're actually borrowing that money. But yeah, it's really not sustainable, and it only shifts the composition of the debt in terms of its long-term and short-term horizon. Debt buybacks, these are really repurchase agreements where the country sells its debt at a discount. Again, there's its own pros and cons. It offers some temporary relief, but it doesn't really address the issue of sustainability. So we can also have a combination of debt restructuring and write-offs that can also be used. Then a hybrid approach where we use both internal resources and probably some external resources, or probably borrowing from key elements from the EPIC initiative. But I think what's important for me to highlight is that a sustainable debt management framework must address the key drivers of that growth. And some of those key drivers, we've already talked about them. The issue of non-inclusive growth, non-sustainable growth, the issues of weak institutions, which is also related to the issues of corruption, the issues of economic diversification and structural transformation of our economies. Those they are very critical issues. So I think there is need for a more comprehensive and holistic approach that fully leverages domestic resources, but also addresses the key drivers of that debt in an inclusive and broad-based framework. Because the Afro has come up with the borrowing charter with some of those principles that can also help us and guide us. So in terms of the key recommendations, number one, I think I've already alluded to this. We need a comprehensive citizen debt audit. This can be undertaken by Parliament in partnership with CSOs. There's need for an inclusive debt management framework that encompasses a multi-stakeholder approach in terms of coming up with realistic and feasible strategies. Policy consistency is also very key in terms of how we coordinate our policies and how we coordinate government ministries, government departments, and non-government entities. I think the approach of the whole of society, I think, becomes very critical in terms of strategic partnerships between both governments, private sector, the unions, as well as civil society organizations. Then other countries we've also seen, in terms of best practice, they've come up with a charter in terms of fiscal responsibility, which really aims at instituting and institutionalizing fiscal discipline in terms of macroeconomic and public finance management. I think the issue of fiscal discipline is very, very critical. And through fiscal responsibility charters, fiscal responsibility acts, those kind of institutions and rules can help to ensure fiscal responsibility in the economy. Very, very important recommendation. I think the issue of central bank autonomy is very, very critical going forward. Because the central bank can never be 100% autonomous, but it can be sufficiently and strongly autonomous to be able to ward off any pressures from the executive, for example, in terms of the usage of the overdraft facility, or also even in terms of the printing of money, both of which are detrimental for macroeconomic stability and macroeconomic sustainability. The issue of enhancing transparency and accountability, that's also very, very critical. Institutional reforms, even in terms of how public resources are managed, the extractive industries, transparency initiative, the publish what you pay, I think those can also help to ensure greater light, greater transparency, and greater accountability in terms of the way we manage our public resources. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Let me end here, otherwise I'll spend the whole day.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stambara, for such a extensive, comprehensive presentation. I think at this time I will ask our discussants to occupy some chairs. And Honorable Mshoriwa, Mr. John Manyanya, Masimba Kuchera, and Rumbidzai Makon. Well, as they are coming here, I have one or two questions for you, Prosper, in your presentation, which I thoroughly enjoyed. You said that in 1980, we inherited 700 million USD, and mainly that debt arose from sanction busting and also buying arms. And we felt as Zimbabweans, it was an unfair debt for us. Come 2021, from 1980 up to now, we have incurred, or the government has incurred debt, including the RBZ redemption debt, ZISCO, ZAMCO. I wanted to find out from you, and obviously my discussants, my panelists will also assist. Were these fair? Were we consulted? Were these things justified? These debts which were incurred by the independent government. That's one. Then the second point I wanted also to highlight, and maybe in your study you could have picked this up. There is the issue of the money borrowed. I think in your presentation you mentioned some issues of, in 2020, that there were loans of 320 million to Wange, and also PP 28, I think 2021, to COVID of 10 million USD dollars, and some guarantees. Government in 2020 issued some guarantees totaling 15.18 million US dollars. Were these things approved by Parliament? Well, maybe parliamentarians will answer for themselves. But my final third point is the issue of corruption and the transparency. And I looked at the issue of COVID, and I was wondering what's so special about some of our leaders putting their money in the till as it is. In Zimbabwe, where Dr. Obadiah Moyo had to leave office because of the issue of COVID funds, which were not properly handled. South Africa with Dr. Zwali Mkhize, South African Minister of Health, also was fired because of that. And then in Malawi with Kenny Kandozo, also involved in this, and he was fired. And I'm sure there will be others. These are only things which I'm mentioning. What's so special about our leaders that they steal money meant for social services in such an important thing as COVID-19? And I mean, Prosper, if you can give us some highlights, but hopefully our discussants also will pick these things up in their presentations. But maybe we can start with you, Prosper, before I come to my discussants. Just a brief remarks. Thanks.
Hello?
Yes,
I'm really sorry, colleagues. I think we had lost sound. So I only heard the last part where you're talking about COVID-19 corruption. I lost sound from my end. So I couldn't capture what you were saying. I was just seeing you talking, but I couldn't hear what you're saying.
Okay, fine. I'll repeat. I mentioned that in your report, you said in 1980, we inherited at independent $700 million from the colonial government. And that money was to pay for arms and also sustain white supremacy as it is, sanction busting. And I'm saying, and we thought people are saying it's unfair, it's unjust. But subsequent to that, in the 1990s, 80s, 90s, and 20s, the Zimbabwean government, through a number of strategies, came up with RBZ, Debt Redemption Fund, ZISCO, Steel, ZAMCO, and many others. And my question to you was, in your studies, were these things justified? Are they fair? Were we involved as participants, as citizens? And were these things approved by Parliament? And then the third and final comment is the last one, where I mentioned that 3 ministers of finance, one from Zimbabwe, Dr. Obadiah Moyo, lost his job. Zwali Mkhize from South Africa, Minister of Health, lost his job. And Kenny Kandozo from Malawi, all pilfered or were involved in issues of corruption in terms of the COVID funds. And I'm saying, what's so special about this, that our leaders, put their hands in the cookie as it were? Is there something which we can, if you want to comment on that one, but I'm sure some of our participants here, our panelists, can also comment on those issues. So that I just wanted you to make some brief remarks on that before I go to the panelists.
All right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Thank you. Let me maybe comment on the first one where you were asking whether it's proper for the government to be assuming some of these debts. With respect to the first debt of 700 billion that we assumed from the Rhodesians, I think it's also fair to say that part of this loan also went towards financing industrialization within the Rhodesian economy at that time. Remember, in 1980, Zimbabwe inherited a very, very robust and strong economy that was fairly and relatively well diversified and well industrialized. In fact, we're number 2 in terms of industrialization in sub-Saharan Africa at independence in 1980. So obviously part of that loan also was used in terms of driving the Rhodesian economy, driving the industrialization agenda, and obviously the overall sanctions, busting and mitigation strategy of the government. So I think I can say probably we also, to some extent, we benefited from that debt, in the sense that we inherited a very strong economy. Remember, even the Zimbabwean dollar in 1980 was stronger than the US dollar. I think it was also part of that the whole sanction busting, import substitution, industrialization of the Rhodesian government, which was also financed with some of this borrowing. Whether the RBZ data, I know the RBZ data assumption one, this one is a very sensitive, and even when talking to people, there are some people that are in support of the assumption. Of course, there are some people, most people, who feel that probably the ordinary citizen didn't benefit, because most of it was, of these funds were really used to finance the quasi-fiscal activities of the central bank. So I think there are some people who feel that they didn't benefit much from the quasi-fiscal activities. Because remember, the argument by the Reserve Bank was that, in terms of the necessity of quasi-fiscal activities, was that they were using these quasi-fiscal, they were trying to use these quasi-fiscal activities as a way also of busting the CDERA and the EU sanctions. But of course, we were not very, very effective in terms of doing that. So I think there are a lot of people that feel maybe the people that directly benefited should have paid for that, and not probably not ask every citizen, the taxpayer, to pay that burden. So I think those are some of the arguments that are there. There are some people that support, and there are also a lot of people that feel that maybe the people that directly benefited from these fiscal activities, whether they are companies, because there are some companies that also benefited, and there are some individuals, the farmers, that also benefited from that. So I think those are some of the arguments, and also the opinions amongst public. I think maybe let me end there for now and allow the esteemed panelists, then we can probably come in.
Okay, fine. So the third one, we'll get it from the panelists, where I was talking about the COVID funds and the looting by the ministers of health. Okay, we can get it from the other participants on it. Are we still together, Prosper?
Hello?
Did you get me my third question? Or
What did you say? Sorry.
I was talking about the looting of funds of COVID by ministers of finance, when I was saying, is there something peculiar about it? That's the question.
Maybe let me ask that one. Let me ask my panelists to deal with that one. But also one final point that I should also have highlighted. Also, it then also becomes critical for the citizens and parliament to undertake that comprehensive debt audit that I talked about earlier on. Well, that would then also help to distinguish and to separate illegitimate or odious debt and legitimate debt and illegitimate debt, genuine debt and odious debt. It has happened in Mozambique, and I'm sure we can also learn from the Mozambican experience in terms of undertaking comprehensive citizen debt audit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. At this stage, I'll come to our panelists, and we'll start with Honorable Edwin Mshoriwa. Is a member of the Parliament Portfolio Committee on the budget. Your reaction to the report, your comments, Honorable. I'll give you about 7 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Radenge. Well, let me start by acknowledging the report as presented by Dr. Prosper Chitambala. You know, the challenge of debt in Zimbabwe is that as the figures and the graphs which were tabled by Dr. Tambara proved, our debt in this country has actually been going up, I think from the 80s up to now. My view, and we also want to thank that the debt office under the Ministry of Finance, and we want to acknowledge the work that Mr. Vumbe and team are trying to do. But we still believe that there's a lot that needs to be done. We don't believe that the figures that we have, even the 10.7 billion US dollar, truly reflect the amount of debt that Zimbabwe has. Our view is actually based on a simple analysis on the figures that the Public Debt Office has put on the table, and also a glance and an analysis of other things that are happening. For example, it is now clear, if you check under the line ministries, there are a number of ministries that actually owe certain organizations monies that dates back to years, which monies are not added when we talk of the total debt that we have. You look at the state enterprises. Recently, we've been doing an audit, just checking how many of the state enterprises that we have, our parastatals, that are technically insolvent, whose liabilities exceed their assets, whose monies are likely and are supposed to be taken over by the government, which in a way are supposed to aid even to the debt level. Then if you check the 3.5 billion that is mentioned, the farmers, the global land agreement, the money is not included in this 10.7 billion, but in reality, it's already a contingent liability, and the question of whether or not the sessions have not been signed is neither here nor there. Our only calculations and our only view is that there is a possibility that the amount of debt that we owe as a country, if you factor in what is contained within the state enterprises, even within the local authorities, whose debt is guaranteed by the government, you then find out that we do have a huge chunk of debt, which may possibly be somewhere around close to 20 billion. The domestic debt, yes, it's true that it has gone down, but at what expense? Because you need to look at the debt when the Zim dollar was 1:1, because all that debt was borrowed domestically, mainly from your pension funds, your insurance funds. Those were the people that were buying the treasury bills. But the people that ended up paying the debt when we came up with the statutory instrument are your pensioners, are your insurance members, who then need to carry the government on their back. And in reality, I think as a country we'll actually be losing. Because one of the key parameters of debt is to then say, after you've taken a debt, what has happened? Because a debt in a country should, at the end of the day, benefit the people. But if you analyze the debt, Zimbabwean debt, you then realize that most of our debt is now accumulating because of arrears. We are failing to pay our arrears, and because of that, the burden is coming to each and every Zimbabwean. There's a general feeling that every kid that is born in Zimbabwe, before he or she does anything, he has got a debt on his head. And this is the biggest challenge, because anything that has to happen, in my view, should at the end of the day benefit the ordinary citizen. Then our view pertaining to how we can improve transparency in terms of debt management in this country is for government to speed up the implementation of IPSAS, which is the International Public Sector Accounting. We believe that a government, as things stand, unless we come up with a sort of an accrual sort of accounting, and we move away from this cash accounting that we've been doing, we won't be in a position to take cognizance of our debt level. Then the last thing that I may also need to talk about, Dr. Adenge, you spoke about the COVID and why you find the ministers being picked up, ministers of health. It's just a tip of the iceberg, in the sense that COVID is the in thing, and naturally that's where the monies are coming through, and wonder why people could actually put their hands into the pot. But it's the question of ensuring that we should try by all means to ensure that organizations like ZAC and other organizations that fight corruption are actually resourced so that good work is done, and including Parliament for that matter. Because most of these debts, whenever a debt is accrued, you need to then say, where is the money gone to? As a banker myself, what we used to do to do is, when you give a client money and the client says, no, I want to buy, this money is for capital expenditure, you would actually then do a follow-up. And those things need to be done, because it's not enough to simply acquire a debt without showing the return thereof of that debt. So in my view, and I want to just end by saying, debt is not bad. What is bad is getting debt that does not generate revenue at the end of the day, debt that will end up being a burden to the society. I thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Honorable. Maybe we'll come back to you at some later stage to really find out the progress which your portfolio committee has made, because, you know, from the reports where we hear that government has committed this is, if you as a portfolio committee or as Parliament, you know, being involved. And I'm glad that this is the third meeting we are meeting, and you were part and parcel of the past two stakeholder meetings themselves, whether there's been any progress, but maybe we'll come back to you later. At this stage, I'll ask Madam to make your remarks on the presentation which was made by Dr. Stamba.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I pretty much do agree with the honorable member in regard to how debt is being managed or mismanaged in the country. And I'm looking at it from a feminist point of view. I think at the beginning, Janet did speak to how poverty has a feminist face. Poverty has a woman's face. And, you know, from the report or from the presentation that we saw, our debt is high, and we are paying through the nose for this. And this has an effect on public services. And I think you all agree with me that with the advent of COVID-19, we really saw an exacerbation of poor service delivery. I'll give an example of water. We do know that we have some loans from the Chinese to improve our water systems, but we haven't really seen any of that happening. And women are the ones that bear the brunt. They are the ones that have to go and queue at public boreholes, etc., to access the water. So from our point of view as civil society, there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of addressing debt, especially odious debt. There's an issue of transparency and accountability that also came out from the report. And we are not getting much of that transparency and accountability as civil society. We are not getting as much as we would want to get. Examples are the delayed publishing of the Auditor General's report. And so that has a ripple effect even on how fast Parliament can then act on some of the findings of that report. And then we get into a new budget cycle. So you find that it just gets to be things get worse as the years go by, and women are the ones who are bearing the brunt of our irresponsibility in debt management. And then the honorable member also spoke about the 3.6 billion that has gone into agriculture. Again, we are saying, how are women benefiting from these funds? You will find that most women are regarded as small-scale farmers and are not able to actually access this funding. But in terms of payment, we are at the forefront of paying this, of paying these debts through the IMTT. We are the vendors, we are the small-scale farmers, we are the small traders. So for us, and my reaction is we need more transparency and we need more accountability. We really believe that there is no need for us to get into extra debt. As a country, I think we need to limit the amount of debt we are getting ourselves into, limit illicit financial flows, and one way or the other, we will be able to sustain ourselves. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for your contribution. You know, that debt also has got a feminine issue to it. And I'm glad that you are also participating in this, that, you know, we'll take it from there. But I wanted to find out whether, you know, of course there will be another session where we really go into detail on the issues of women and their participation in this process. And maybe we can come to that later. At this stage, I want to go to, with two Masimbas here. Masimba Kuchera is an economist. You heard the presentation from Prosper, from Dr. Chambara, I'm sure. I would want your perspectives. Maybe you could also touch on the issue. I should also have asked the honorable member of the budget committee, you know, the issue of the SDR. There have been a lot of workshops and seminars on SDRs. And maybe just to find out, you know, what progress, where are we? Thank you, you can go ahead, Mr.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Just to make a small correction, I'm an economic analyst. I don't count numbers. Thank you very much, Dr. Kadenge, and also Dr. Chitambara for the presentation. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things we should strongly look at in terms of the paper. And one of them is social protection. Looking at people with disabilities, social protection becomes key because of some of the factors that Dr. Chitambara talked about. One, levels of unemployment and so on. So you'll find that the paper does outline a number of things that we are talking about. The first one, which is a very interesting irony, is that we continue to hear this term budget surplus. It sounds very interesting that we always have a surplus. And a surplus for me simply means that you are making more than you are spending, or you are opting not to spend on what you are supposed to spend on, so that you can think that you have more money. And one of those areas in which then spending is limited or misdirected is social protection. Why do I say that? When you look at, for instance, with regards to people with disabilities, government does not have a database
of the number of people with disabilities in this country. So how do you properly direct programs like social protection in a time of COVID to a constituency like that? The second issue that I also thought would be important to mention in relation to the paper is the issue of whenever we increase our debt stock and our debt burden, it is these issues in terms of infrastructure, social protection, that is where initially the money is taken away from to be able to pay the debt. So you will find even when we had our structural adjustment programs, we cut on social service delivery, social protection, and veered to a zionere or a do-it-yourself type economy where those with resources then started doing things on their own, and the government, whose responsibility it is to look after vulnerable people, was no longer doing that. They would argue that it was on advice from those who were giving them money, but I'm sure if it is bad advice, you are also allowed to reject bad advice. You just don't take advice wholesomely because you're supposed to take it. The final thing that I wanted to mention in relation to the presentation by Dr. Chitambara is that I think the paper adequately talks about issues to do with corruption, and I think Dr. Kadenga, you raised some of the issues. To say one of the major internal leakages that we have in terms of even debt contraction is corruption. Talk about some of the infrastructure projects, talk about even some of the social protection payments. Stories are there where people who are not supposed to benefit also have their net one numbers listed with the social welfare. All due to either lack of oversight or that issue that I pointed out to say there is not a sufficient, there is not a database. So anyone can be everyone in such a process. So I think it's important for us then to go back and say, if we want to be efficient and effective in terms of using the resources that we have and direct them accordingly, it then becomes important for us to put the foundational blocks for us to do that well. One of them is, of course, eradicating corruption and opportunities for such. But one of those is to target those in need. The only way that we can target those in need is to find out where they are. And the only way that we can find out where those people are is to, in this case, either create a database or consolidate the information that we have. Because I think that as CSOs, as government, we have pockets of information here and there. But because sometimes we act in silos, that information cannot be consolidated and coordinated. And that's why we find ourselves where we are. So I think one of the key recommendations then could be, let's then start coordinating ourselves better, put in sufficient foundational blocks in terms of ensuring that we don't we don't wrongly direct resources by just throwing resources anyhow, so that we can tick a box and say, for social protection, it increased from 2 billion to 5 billion. But was it being directed at the right target? Or did we waste on an opportunity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masimba. I think the key issue which you mentioned here is, without any database, how do you direct in assistance? I think that's a very critical point. At this juncture, I will ask the other Masimba Manyanya to give his perspectives on the presentation, but maybe also just to find out from him, and maybe to say the issue which was raised by Kuchera, the issue of database. I know, I'm aware that the business community, maybe the business community can answer also for themselves, that there is a fund which is supposed to target companies who have been affected. I'm not sure whether there is a database there. If you know of any other progress, it will be interesting. But I'm sure you can also just comment on the SDR, and I will just give you 5 minutes.
Right, thank you very much, Mr. Kadenge. I think, firstly, acknowledging the report by Dr. Chitambara, two things come to my mind after following the presentations this morning. And the first, I'd like to, well, in terms of those two things, the first is the explosion of data. Whenever we have these debt conferences, debt workshops and all that, it is now a familiar scenario that you have this whole massive explosion of economic information descending upon us, so that I think to the uninitiated, it can be depressing sometimes if you are not an economist or an accountant. But it's a fact that is raining upon us. And I think the data that came upon us this morning as Chitambara was making his presentation points to a very important trend, or important trends, if I might put it that way. And let's rise above that whole data and ask ourselves, what are the key trends that are emerging, that are being depicted by those figures? And I think it's important to tease out 3 important trends. The first one, we have a massive expansion in population demand for social investment goods, regionally, globally, and particularly in Zimbabwe. That's a fact. And this is in a context, this is the second one, this is in a context of contracting economies and diminishing domestic savings. That's a fact. This is information that continues to come up over and over again over the decades. We know now that when we attend a debt conference, we are going to be told that human investment needs are expanding faster than the economies are growing. So in real terms, we're having a contraction in the economy and a diminishing, a downslide in terms of the domestic savings. Now, what does this mean? Those two trends mean that we have a pervasive tendency towards borrowing and debt accumulation. Now, the last issue is, if we have all this information being repeated over and over again for the past few decades, why is the world chasing after an illusion? Because it means that we are not being able to fix that problem. We started hearing about debt relief, all these debt accumulation problems and all that, almost about 40 years ago. And we keep hearing about the same problem. Why is it that we do not have a database on the available solutions? And it keeps being elusive. I'm saying the world is chasing after an illusion when it comes to debt issues. We are not coming up with sustainable, firm, strong solutions that address the gender-differentiated impacts of debt, that address the youth-differentiated impact of debt, that address the issues to do with people with disabilities, people in the rural areas, and all those vulnerable sectors. It's not really the issue of painting a depressing trend of debt accumulation, but I think the focus of the region and the world in particular Zimbabwe, should be now towards what is it that we are getting wrong. Because certainly I think there is something that we are failing to reach out to. So coming to the last issue, I don't want to revisit all those figures because I know some of us are not economists, and I think economics has got a depressing trend sometimes, myself being one of them. But the issue of thieving, you know, you have whole ministers stealing COVID funds. I think the money that these guys are paid is fairly good. And if it was some district officer who was caught stealing COVID funds, maybe we could have tolerated that. I think it points to the last issue that we need to address as a matter of urgency, which is the issue of economic governance. How are we going to deal with the debt issue if we have all these illicit outflows? How are we going to deal with the debt issue if we have whole ministers stealing COVID funds? How are we going to deal with the debt issue when our economic governance systems are in a state of collapse? And those pilferages that Mr. Kadenge referred to highlight a very serious regional problem in terms of economic governance. That is what it does. It highlights the fact that we as a region face a very serious problem of economic governance, in particular debt governance, and we are not likely to address that issue conclusively if we don't come to grips with what constitutes debt and economic governance. We have tried to deal with these issues at ZimCode, and I think the issue remains on the table. It's a very complex issue, but at the end, I think it calls for honesty, sincerity, and all those human values that sit in people, human beings who seek a better life beyond what we are experiencing right now when the vote time comes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manyanya. I think you've raised quite pertinent issues, but I think at the end of the day, we are saying solution is not going to come from elsewhere, isn't it? And that's why we are here, that's why you are there. Solution has to come from us. And as you can see from the report which we're looking at, is to say we must take charge ourselves. And here we've been given an opportunity by ZimCode and Afrodat to sit down with our legislators and ask questions and make proposals. And maybe in time, really find out a framework of whether we are making progress or not. So we may be part of the problem, but we can also be part of the solution. Let's be part of the solution. Thank you very much. I think at this stage, we also need to hear from the floor itself, from the members who have been here since morning, for you to be able to make your contribution to this discussion, which I think is critical. So we'll have a moving mic, just introduce yourself and pose your question. Thank you.
Victor Boroma again. My question is directed to Honorable Mshorewa. We understand that according to the RBZ Act of 2015, the RBZ overdraft facility is only 20% of the GDP of the previous year. So we've seen that over the years, the government has obviously abused this facility, and there's a parallel funding mechanism that is actually going on there. So my question is, as a member of parliament, what are you doing to ensure that the government abides to the law? Because it's something that has been going on for a long time. And since we are talking about debt issues, so what is actually being done?
Thank you. I think we'll have another question. You are not here, Honorable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Yolanda Millen. I'm a social and economic justice ambassador. And understanding that these engagements are meant to have a way forward that actually sees us attaining the betterment of the living conditions of the people, looking at the debt situation and the debt crisis. My question goes to the members of parliament, not particularly to the one who is on the panel, but maybe to those who were also present in a similar engagement last year, to say, we had recommendations that we had last year. How far are we with those? And asking this because we talked about the adaptation and the implementation of the African Borrowing Charter. So for this engagement, for this type of engagements to have sense at the end of the day, we need to have a follow-up to say, if we had those recommendations, how far are we, what have we done, what have been the problems that were faced, so that we also have countermeasures on dealing with those problems that then come up, but having a sign to show that these engagements are not simply a platform for us to sit and complain and give recommendations that are not going to be taken up further. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Prince Mpindo. I'm a social economic justice ambassador. My question is, in as much as I want to comment on the previous speaker who alluded to that poverty and debt as a human face, and that is a feminist face. And also at the same time, I want to ask the panelists and the parliamentarians present that where are young people situated in terms of debt management, debt contracting, given that 67.7%, which is almost 9 million people in Zimbabwe, are young people. But where is the inclusion in terms of young people? How then do we assist? Are we there in the game, or we are just here to hear stories from 1980 up to 2021? Because right now, even the unborn generation, those yet to come, have already been given an obligation to pay for what they do not gain. So the placement of the young people is a question I have here, given that we are the majority, probably not in this room, but in the country.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think for now, try to get some answers or comment. Oh, okay. Honorable, you want to assist us? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a comment.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think first I will respond directly to the earlier concern that was raised with regards to Parliament and accountability. I think as long as there is no clarity in terms of engaging Parliament, then you can wait annually to ask that question. Because Parliament works through portfolio committees, it works through parliamentary caucuses, it works through champions. And in that context, it's particular and specific. So if there is a parliamentary caucus on debt and development, then that caucus will be more accountable. So there is no need to do an omnibus approach to Parliament. If you have champion MPs that you are training, equipping, on Wednesdays they do the prompt questions or the written questions, they push for bills and motions, then you don't need to wait for an annual review. Other initiatives are already doing that. So if it's not happening, as far as I know, if it's happening, it's not loud enough. Parliament needs to be more specific. And so if you're waiting for an annual review, then you'll be disappointed. I was horrified by what Honorable Msheriwa mentioned earlier on about the unborn Zimbabwean being born into heavy debt and already mortgaged in terms of their future. I think this story is not coming out in the public domain in Zimbabwe right now. It's supposed to be a horrific story, a horrendous story, supposed to be a very emotional story. There are a lot of celebrities who are wasting our time as a country, while there is a bigger national problem that we need to be focusing on. The issues that are trending in Zimbabwe, they are not focusing on this very important issue. To say that a child who is not yet born or even conceived is already in debt, that's a horror story. And I think as Zimbabweans, we are not prioritizing one of the biggest stories of our generation. And our future generations will be born into social economic slavery. So we need to challenge the whole country to make sure that this issue of debt and development becomes more trending, more emotional, especially among young people. They need to know that their future is already mortgaged and they're in trouble. They are already poor before they're even born.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start by answering the question in terms of the RBZ and the government literally abusing the RBZ in terms of funding through the quasi-fiscal activities and other activities. First, I want to state that it's true. In fact, Masimba was complaining in terms of the surplus, that the Minister of Finance would say, no, we have had a surplus. But if you check in the past 2 years, when we had been told that there had been a surplus, when you then see the budget outturn, it will then tell you that we have actually had a deficit. And the deficit is primarily because when the Minister of Finance states that we have got a surplus, he is looking into the fiscal figures without factoring in the payments that have been done by the RBZ on behalf of the government. And then when eventually those figures from the RBZ are actually loaded to the fiscal figure, it then proves that we have actually been having a deficit over the past 2 years. Now, the issue which is there, and I want to state that the Portfolio Committee on Budget and Finance has actually been active in terms of trying to ensure that the RBZ remain committed to its core tenets and the statutory requirements which are there. One of the challenges that we have faced in the past, I think 2 or 3 years, when the new Minister of Finance came in, remember when Professor Mtulingwe came, he declared that the era of quasi-fiscal activities by RBZ had actually come to an end. And there have been some progress in terms of that, but the RBZ has, however, over these years, been shooting or overshooting its mandate. And it's something that it worries us as the Parliament, and I think we will need to do more in terms of ensuring that we bring this to order. Then tied to that, the question in terms of recommendations from the 2 meetings that we have had, I'm proud to say that the Parliament, through the Budget and Finance Committee and the Public Accounts Committee that I happen to sit in, we are aware, we've actually in the past few weeks had a meeting with the Debt Office, the Public Debt Office, and we are still in the process of coming up with the report pertaining to, this is the reason why I decided Mr. Vumbe, who is heading the Public Debt Office, they are trying to put the house in order, but they still need a lot of work to be done. Part of the things that has been also happening is that the Public Accounts Committee will be shortly presenting a report, the Auditor General, pertaining to, in a way, Parliament has actually been moving. And I also want to acknowledge the support that we have also gotten from the civic society, especially ZimCode, pertaining to do most of this work, and yet still more needs to be done as we go forward. Then the young people, I think the young people, they'll need also to stand up. Because more often than not, like you rightly said, that the young people constitute the majority of the citizens in this country. And you also rightly pointed out that they do not constitute the majority even in this house. And certainly not even in parliament or in most decision-making bodies. And what I do know, Mr. Chairman, is that power normally is not given, but people have to rise in terms of ensuring that their voices are heard where it matters. We need to see the young people, because apparently one of the things that we boast of as a country, we've got highly educated young people that we are churning from universities, colleges. But we want to see them participating in issues like debt, economic development. They have to be active, rather than, for instance, to simply hope that maybe the older generation will one day say, no, can you guys do this? I think it's a question of us being proactive in terms of going through. Then lastly, Chair, there was a question that you had raised in terms of the SDRs. The Portfolio Committee on Budget and Finance is actually engaging the Minister of Finance. Our hope is that the Minister of Finance, when Parliament resumes on the 7th of October, should come before the August House and present the special drawing rights and how the ministry intends to utilize the money. We wanted to treat the SDR just the way that we treat the budget and other public funds, so that we'll be in a position to do a proper analysis to then see whether government has actually done what it and put the money into good use. So we reckon when Parliament resumes, a statement by the minister to the August House will be done, and thereafter that it will be a public document, and even civic society will be in a position to track and also check the progress thereof.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mshoriwa. We'll go for our last round. Do we still have people questions? At the very back there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kadenga. James Chitagwa is my name. Noting that Zimbabwe is in debt distress, and the presenter highlighted to us that SDRs are only useful or most useful to countries that are not in debt distress. What is civil society doing in tracking the 1 billion that we got as a nation, so that the stats is also on the civil society? What are they doing to make sure that Zimbabwe becomes, or Zimbabwe adopts, the African Borrowing Charter, so that there is improvement in transparency and accountability as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable.
Thank you. My question was specifically for Dr. Chitambara. I'm not sure if he's still in the meeting. Dr. Prosper Chitambara, his presentation.
Hello?
I had a question for Dr. Chitambara.
I just wanted to find out, is he still at the meeting? Hello, Dr.
Yes. I'm in the meeting. I'm still in.
Okay, so you can ask your question.
All right, thank you. In his presentation, he mentioned the amount of debt that Zimbabwe owes to China vis-a-vis the amount of debt that we're owing to Paris Club members. It looks like there's a steady competition in the rate at which we're borrowing from China. And I just wanted to hear from him what are the implications in terms of our continued borrowing to China? Are they a riskier source of debt? Are there any particular implications in terms of our continued reliance to that particular source of funding?
Hello, did you hear the question?
Yes, I heard the question. I will answer maybe later. I will allow for more questions if they are there.
Okay. Yeah, but I know, of course, there is a session on China. But let's hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Len Monyamzanga. My question is, we have heard a lot about this issue of death, the figures, which are so depressing. If you think that my daughter, which is yet to come, is already in distress, it's so boring, I would say. However, my question is there room for removal of a debt based on humanitarian basis? To simply say, guys, I think we have suffered enough. Of course, there are issues of human rights, there are issues of what, but can you find mercy on us and at least maybe remove this debt? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mine is just, Blessing Makora is my name. Mine is just a comment to what I heard in the presentation. There is a lot of illicit financial flows that is happening. There's a lot of corruption we read. We have heard from His Excellency the idea of zero tolerance to corruption. But when I listen to the figures in terms of domestic debt, in terms of the international debt, and what I think is given us by Almighty, it's really painful. Because now we are almost 2-3 years into the government, the new dispensation. Already we can see signs we are now going into another electoral competition. The issue of promises vis-a-vis delivery, it's really breaking my heart. So I don't know, we have got leaders in parliament right now who are here. Can we do something around these whole issues? The whole world is laughing at Zimbabwe because what God has given us, we are just abusing to our own individual interests. It's unfortunate theological reflection will come last. But I think this is the important conversation we must have right now to say, are we really serious? We can't go and say, cancel our debts when they know we've got the capacity to pay. And instead of us paying, we are accumulating more. It's really an embarrassment. I hope we can be able to look into our hearts and cry for mercy from the Lord and start afresh. Otherwise, we will still gather and nothing happens, but may the Lord help us. He has given us enough to attend to our needs, but we are just being selfish. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is David Makwerere. My question is probably directed to Dr. Chitambara and perhaps connected also to what was presented earlier on by Theophilus. On the recommendations, Dr. Chitambara, I think he talked a lot about some very interesting things. But I was going to be also interested maybe in terms of how the natural resources that we have and their transformative potential in terms of balancing things, in terms of reducing the burden that we have and that we are definitely going to pass to the next generation and the next generation. That's one. But number two, which is probably far-fetched, but I'm worried and I'm trying to establish a connection. This relates to an article that I read, I think last week or the other week, which talked about military in Zimbabwe and the military being a public institution. I wonder if there is enough oversight in terms of their investments, because I believe that could be another, channel where our resources are escaping, the accountability lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll have the last.
Thank you. My suggestion, I think this whole discussion when it comes to debt, I think what is important is to develop a culture where when you borrow, you have to pay. I think it's as simple as that. So how do we endear that culture? I'm sorry, I don't agree with the idea that we have an excuse for not paying even the Rhodesian debt. That's an excuse. A country does not end with any type of leadership. We are responsible for the past, present, and the future. Now, when we know that we are responsible and we have to pay, so my suggestion is that as a people, as Zimbabwe, the first step should to say, why should we enjoy breakfast with some eggs when we have such a huge debt? That's the first question. So when I was thinking on the presentation and people are already thinking about how to use the SDRs, we have a debt. Don't even think we don't have money. That's simple. So we should always start even our budgets. Our parliamentarians should actually question these hard questions to say, what are we doing to service our debts? We haven't been doing it, and it's wrong. You don't borrow so that you don't pay. So what we need to do is, there should be a strict allocation in our budget every year towards debt repayment. And this can be done. It's only 10 billion. It's not much given the size of our country. We can actually repay if we are committed. But I get a sense that there's a lot of, we have every reason to say someone somewhere should forgive our debt. Why? We used the money, we borrowed, we should pay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll leave the last person there before we go.
Facilitator, I was not going to make a contribution, but I can't be silent. Is that we inherited. I believe Zimbabwe should not pay that money was given to Zimbabwe by some sharks, some people giving money because they knew Zimbabwe was going to be independent. And they knew that Zimbabwe was then supposed to pay to them. And yet Zimbabwe at that time, Rhodesia was under sanctions where you against colonialism. Now, if you look at that money, you will find that it was short-term money with a hand to pauperize Africans, to marginalize Africans. That money was coming from sharks in